Imagine standing on ground that is actively being created beneath your feet. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, literally. The earth beneath you is still forming, still shifting, still deciding what shape it wants to take. Somewhere a few kilometers below the surface, magma is moving, and you are standing directly on top of it. This is Iceland, and the first thing you notice when you arrive is that nothing about this place feels finished. The mountains look like they were torn apart and reassembled in a hurry. The coastline is jagged and raw, as if the ocean is still negotiating with the land over where one ends and the other begins. Even the roads seem to work around the landscape rather than through it, looping around lava fields that nobody cleared because, well, what would be the point? The lava was here long before the roads, and it will be here long after, for a place so far north, so geologically violent, and so isolated in the middle of the North Atlantic, about 300 kilometers from Greenland and nearly 1,000 from mainland Europe. You might expect to arrive and find a population clinging to survival. And in some ways, that would not be entirely wrong. But in other ways, it would miss the point almost completely. Iceland is home to roughly 370,000 people, fewer than many single neighborhoods in cities like Tokyo or Sao Paulo. And yet this country manages to operate a functional democracy, a world-class healthcare system, a literary tradition stretching back over 1,000 years, and an economy that, after one of the most spectacular financial collapses in modern history, somehow rebuilt itself from the ground up. All of this in a place where the sun barely rises in winter and barely sets in summer, where volcanoes interrupt daily life with the same routine inconvenience most people reserve for heavy traffic, and where the nearest McDonald's, well, there isn't one. Iceland is one of the few countries in the world that no longer has a single McDonald's franchise. They left in 2009 and never came back. But that's getting ahead of things. The first question most people ask when they think about Iceland is a simple one. Why would anyone choose to live here in the first place? And the answer, like most things about this country, turns out to be more complicated than it first appears. When you fly into Reykjavik and the plane begins its descent, the view from the window looks like nothing else on Earth. Vast stretches of dark volcanic rock, flat and cracked like old leather. Steaming vents rising from the ground with no obvious source. Green patches appearing in surprising places where geothermal heat has created conditions nothing should be growing in. And then the city itself, small and colorful, sitting right at the edge of the water with mountains behind it that look close enough to touch. The scale of everything here takes some time to process. Iceland is roughly the size of Kentucky, but feels somehow larger, maybe because so much of it is empty, not abandoned, just never occupied in the first place. The interior of the country, known as the Highlands, is essentially uninhabited. No towns, no permanent settlements, just volcanic rock, glaciers, rivers, and sky. About 2/3 of Iceland's population lives in and around Reykjavik, which means that the rest of this enormous landscape, with its fjords and waterfalls and geothermal fields, is home to around 100,000 people spread very, very thin. Drive an hour outside the capital, and you can travel for long stretches without seeing another car. Step out, and the silence is the kind that has weight to it. Not just an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, something older. The landscape does most of the talking in Iceland, and it speaks loudly. There are around 130 volcanoes in the country, of which about 30 have erupted since it was first settled. The most famous eruption in recent memory is probably Eyjafjallajökull, whose 2010 event grounded flights across Europe for weeks and introduced most of the world to the experience of trying to pronounce something they had never seen written before. But for Icelanders, it was just another eruption. Not routine exactly, but not surprising either. Iceland sits directly on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. The two plates are moving apart by about 2 centimeters every year, which means Iceland is literally growing, slightly wider every single year, pushed apart by forces working deep underground. More recently, the Reykjanes Peninsula, just southwest of Reykjavik, saw a series of eruptions that began in 2021 and continued for years after. Entire neighborhoods near the town of Grindavik had to be evacuated. Lava crossed roads and reached buildings. And Icelanders adapted in the way they always seem to adapt, with practicality, a degree of dark humor, and a willingness to keep living in the same general vicinity of the thing that keeps threatening to disrupt their lives. Because what is the alternative? Leave. Iceland's entire history has been about not leaving. The weather adds another layer to all of this. Iceland's climate is classified as subarctic, though it is considerably milder than that label suggests in coastal areas, thanks to the Gulf Stream. Reykjavik rarely gets as cold in winter as cities like Oslo or Stockholm, but cold is not really the defining feature of Icelandic weather. Wind is, and change. The kind of change that happens between the time you leave your house and the time you reach the end of your street. Sunshine, rain, sleet, fog, and wind strong enough to turn an umbrella inside out in the span of a single hour. There is an old saying here that if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes. Which sounds familiar because some version of it exists in almost every unpredictable climate in the world. But in Iceland, it carries a particular urgency. The weather doesn't just change, it commits. One moment the sky is clear and the light is the kind of pale gold you only get this far north, and the next, everything disappears into horizontal rain and visibility drops to nearly nothing. It is not a place that rewards complacency, and yet it is a place that rewards patience. Because between the storms, Iceland produces light unlike anything most people have ever seen. In summer, the sun circles low on the horizon for hours, casting long shadows and flooding everything with a warm amber glow that makes ordinary things look extraordinary. The famous midnight sun is not just a phenomenon, it is an experience that rewires something in how you think about time and rest and rhythm. Tourists set alarms for 3 in the morning just to catch the sun dipping briefly below the horizon before climbing back up. And in winter, the darkness comes, completely and thoroughly. In Reykjavik, December days offer about 4 to 5 hours of daylight. Further north, even less. The sun rises late, travels low, and disappears quickly. In its place, if you are fortunate, the northern lights appear. The aurora borealis is one of those things that photographs cannot fully prepare you for. Even people who have seen hundreds of images describe the experience of watching it in person as something different. The lights move, they shift and fold and sometimes pulse, like something alive and unhurried, against a sky that out here, far from any significant light pollution, is dense with stars in a way that city dwellers rarely see. It is, in every sense, extraordinary. But that darkness in winter is not just beautiful, It is also heavy, and it is something Icelanders have been living with and building systems around for a very long time. Iceland was not always inhabited. For most of its existence, it was a completely empty island, shaped by volcanic forces, slowly covered with moss and grass, with no human presence at all. The first people to arrive, around the late 9th century, were Norse settlers. Vikings in the broad popular sense of the word, though the reality of who these people were and why they came is more layered than that word typically suggests. The traditional date given for the first permanent settlement is 874 AD, when a Norwegian chieftain named Ingolfur Arnarsson arrived and made his home on the southwestern coast. According to the old sagas, he threw the wooden pillars of his high seat into the sea as he approached land, vowing to settle wherever they washed ashore. They came ashore in a bay full of steam and hot springs. He called it Reykjavik, which translates roughly to Smoky Bay. It is still the capital today. Same bay, same steam, same name. Just a few more people. In the decades that followed, other settlers arrived, many from Norway, others from Norse settlements in Ireland and Scotland, bringing with them Celtic companions and slaves whose descendants would become part of the Icelandic population. By around 930 AD, the settlers had established the Althing, one of the oldest parliaments in the world, a gathering held annually at a site called Thingvellir, where the tectonic plates are visible as a rift in the landscape and where chieftains would meet to settle disputes and make decisions affecting the whole community. The Althing still exists. Iceland is still governed by it, the same institution still functioning after more than 1,000 years. This matters because it says something about how Icelanders see themselves. The connection to the past here is not just nostalgic or ceremonial, it is structural. The legal and civic traditions that shape modern Iceland are genuinely descended from the systems those first settlers built, and the language spoken today, Icelandic, is closer to the Old Norse spoken by those settlers than virtually any other language in the world. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish have all changed significantly over the centuries. Icelandic changed much less. This is partly because of isolation, which slowed linguistic drift, and partly because of deliberate effort. Iceland has a tradition of preserving its language that borders on institutional. When new technologies arrive, committees work to create Icelandic words for them rather than simply borrowing from English. The word for computer in Icelandic is tölva, a compound of the words for number and prophetess. The word for telephone is sími, an ancient word meaning thread or cord. The language is treated as something living and worth protecting, not a static relic. This relationship with language runs deeper than grammar. Iceland has one of the highest rates of book publication per capita in the world. Locals say that 1 in 10 Icelanders will publish a book in their lifetime. Reading and writing matter here in a way that goes back to the medieval sagas, the great prose narratives written in the 12th and 13th centuries that documented the lives of the early settlers. The sagas are not just history lessons. They are considered great literature, still read and studied today, not as relics, but as stories. Stories about people navigating difficult choices in a difficult place, which, when you think about it, is still what life in Iceland is largely about. There is another aspect of Icelandic culture that surprises many visitors when they first encounter it: the belief in, or at least the serious cultural acknowledgement of the Huldufolk, or hidden people. These are the elves and concealed beings of Icelandic folklore, said to live in rocks and hills and certain landscapes where, according to tradition, it would be unwise to disturb them. This is not fringe belief. Surveys have found that a significant portion of Icelanders say they believe in the possibility of elves, and a larger portion say they would not rule it out. Roads have reportedly been rerouted to avoid disturbing rocks said to be inhabited. Construction projects have been halted pending consultation with those who specialize in such matters. To outside observers, this can look like superstition surviving in an otherwise modern, rational society, but perhaps that framing misses something. In a country shaped this dramatically by natural forces, where the ground can split open without warning, and where the landscape is genuinely unlike anywhere else, maintaining a deep respect for the land and its unknowability is not entirely irrational. Iceland is a place that regularly reminds you that you do not fully understand it. Treating certain parts of it with a kind of reverence seems, in that context, like a reasonable response. The sense of community here also works differently than in most places. Iceland's population is small enough that most people are connected to most other people through just a few degrees of separation. There is actually an app called Icelandingabók that allows Icelanders to check whether they are related to someone before becoming romantically involved. This is not a joke. Genealogical records in Iceland trace back for centuries with unusual completeness, and the app cross-references them. It was built because the country is small enough that meeting a distant cousin without knowing it is a genuine possibility.
That smallness shapes social dynamics in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from the outside. It is difficult to be anonymous in Iceland. Not impossible, but genuinely difficult. When you live in a community where your dentist went to school with your employer and your neighbor is somehow related to your colleague, the social fabric pulls tight. People are accountable in ways that larger societies make easy to avoid. And from that accountability grows something that looks, from the outside, like trust, but from the inside feels more like an unspoken contract. Everyone knows roughly where they stand in relation to everyone else. And within that knowledge, there is a kind of freedom. Not the freedom of anonymity, but the freedom of being known. Meals and hospitality are part of how that social contract is maintained. Icelandic food is, honestly, an interesting challenge for first-time visitors. The traditional cuisine developed under conditions of extreme isolation and harsh winters, which means it prioritizes preservation and sustenance over delicacy. Hakarl, the fermented Greenlandic shark that has been buried and dried for months, is the most famous example. It smells strongly of ammonia and tastes like nothing most people have eaten before. The recommended approach for first-timers is often to chase it immediately with a shot of Brennivine, the caraway-flavored schnapps sometimes called Black Death. This is not fine dining. It is survival food that has outlasted the conditions that created it and is now consumed as much out of cultural pride as genuine enthusiasm.
But there is also skyr, which is somewhere between yogurt and cheese, mild and protein-rich, and which has existed here for 1,000 years. There is fresh fish, lamb raised on open land without antibiotics or hormones, and a general pride in knowing where food comes from and how it was made. The hot dog stands of Reykjavik, the pilsur, are genuinely excellent in a way that is difficult to explain and easy to verify. Icelanders are not people who eat badly. They just eat honestly. The family structure here has also developed in ways that differ from much of the rest of the world. Iceland has one of the highest rates of children born outside of marriage in Europe, and one of the lowest rates of stigma attached to it. Single parenthood, cohabitation without marriage, families of various shapes and arrangements are common and unremarkable. The social support systems are strong enough that people do not feel they need marriage as an economic necessity, which means the people who do get married tend to do so because they genuinely want to. What matters, it seems, is whether the arrangement is working, not whether it conforms to a particular form.
There is a house in Iceland that is heated entirely by the earth beneath it. No furnace, no gas, no burning of anything. Just pipes running down into the ground where the temperature is constant and warm, and a heat exchange system that pulls that warmth up into the building. This is not an unusual house. This is most houses. About 90% of Iceland's homes are heated geothermally. The hot water that comes out of kitchen taps often carries a faint smell of sulfur, which visitors notice immediately and residents stopped noticing years ago. It is the smell of the ground, the smell of something very old providing something very practical. Iceland sits on enough geothermal energy to make fossil fuels largely unnecessary for heating and electricity. The country generates about 99% of its electricity from renewable sources, split between geothermal and hydropower. For a country that imports almost everything else, the ability to heat its homes and power its industries from what is essentially free energy beneath the surface is a significant advantage. It is not something that required great technological innovation so much as the recognition that what other countries have to drill for or ship in, Iceland has in abundance directly beneath them. This energy independence has had some unexpected consequences. Because geothermal heat is cheap and abundant, Iceland has been able to grow vegetables in greenhouses that would otherwise be completely impossible at this latitude. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, even bananas in some experimental facilities, all produced domestically in a country that sits just below the Arctic Circle. If you have virtually unlimited cheap heat, you can maintain the conditions for growth that the climate otherwise refuses to provide. It is the kind of logic that sounds obvious once you hear it, and astonishing before you do. The economy of Iceland is a study in resilience through repeated disruption. For most of the 20th century, it was a fishing economy. Fish were Iceland's primary export, the backbone of national income, and the source of ongoing and sometimes heated disputes with neighboring countries. The Cod Wars, a series of confrontations primarily with Britain between the 1950s and 1970s, involved Iceland unilaterally extending its fishing limits further and further into the surrounding ocean, eventually to 200 nautical miles. Britain and other countries objected. There were incidents involving vessels. It was not quite a war, but it was not friendly either. Iceland eventually prevailed. A remarkable outcome for a country with a population the size of a mid-sized city going up against a major European power. The fishing limits Iceland claimed then are now recognized internationally as standard. Fish remain central to the economy. Iceland catches and exports cod, haddock, capelin, and shrimp in volumes that seem extraordinary for such a small country. The relationship between Icelanders and the sea is not purely economic. It is historical, cultural, and in some ways existential. You cannot fully understand how this country thinks about itself without understanding what the ocean has meant to it.
But fishing is no longer the only story. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Iceland embarked on an experiment in financial liberalization that looked, for a time, like one of the great economic success stories of the era. The banks deregulated, credit flowed, investment expanded, Icelanders borrowed heavily, invested aggressively, and the economy grew at a rate that attracted international admiration. Then 2008 happened. The global financial crisis arrived, and Iceland's three major banks collapsed within days of each other in what was, relative to the size of the economy, the largest banking failure in history. The country was, by most conventional assessments, finished. The currency collapsed. Unemployment spiked. The government fell. What happened next is the part that economists and political scientists still argue about and study. Iceland did not follow the conventional playbook. It did not bail out the banks. It let them fail. It prosecuted the bankers, sending executives to prison in numbers that contrasted sharply with what happened in the United States and Europe after similar collapses. It imposed capital controls to stabilize the currency, and it leaned on its social safety net, kept its welfare systems functioning, and waited. Within a few years, Iceland's economy was recovering. Within a decade, it had largely rebuilt. Tourism, which had been growing before the crisis, accelerated sharply afterward, partly because the collapse of the currency made Iceland suddenly affordable for foreign visitors who had previously found it prohibitively expensive. That tourism boom transformed the country in ways that are still being processed. Before the mid-2000s, Iceland received around 300,000 visitors per year. By the late 2010s, that number had grown to over 2 million annually. In a country of 370,000 people, receiving 2 million visitors per year means dealing with tourist numbers that regularly exceed the local population by a significant multiple. The impact on infrastructure, prices, and the character of certain neighborhoods and natural sites has been substantial. The famous Blue Lagoon, a geothermal spa that began as an industrial byproduct of a nearby power plant and became one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, went from a hidden local secret to requiring advance booking months out. Iceland has been navigating the tension between being genuinely welcoming to visitors and protecting what makes it worth visiting in the first place. Some natural sites now require fees and advance registration. Others have faced informal visitor limits. The question of how to manage tourism responsibly is one the country is working through in real time because the scale of what happened was without real precedent. There is also the economy of information and technology, which has grown quietly but steadily. Iceland's stable, cheap electricity and cold ambient temperatures make it attractive for data center operations, since cooling servers is one of the major costs of running large-scale computing infrastructure. Several companies have established data centers here precisely because the energy economics make sense in ways they don't elsewhere. A newer part of the economy, still relatively small but growing. What makes Iceland's economic story interesting is not just the specific industries, but the philosophy that seems to run through how the country manages what it has. There is a pragmatism here that resists ideological purity. Iceland is not socialist by strict definition, but its social safety nets are extensive. It is not libertarian, but it has shown willingness to let institutions fail rather than prop them up indefinitely. It is a country that has taken resources that seemed like obstacles, volcanic ground, isolation, extreme weather, and found ways to make them into advantages. Geothermal energy, fisheries that benefit from some of the richest waters in the North Atlantic, a location that works for certain logistics and infrastructure purposes. A landscape so dramatic that it attracts millions of people willing to pay significant sums to experience it. The modern Icelandic economy is layered and sometimes contradictory, but it functions, and the people who live within it seem by most available measures to be doing reasonably well.
There is a word in Icelandic that has become known worldwide, "Þetta reddast," usually translated as "it will work out." It is far from naive optimism. Instead, it is a deeply held belief formed over generations of surviving volcanoes, severe storms, and financial collapses. It is the quiet philosophy of a people who know that catastrophe is survivable, making it slightly easier to keep going. This philosophy is tested most severely during the Icelandic winter, when days pass in a gray twilight. Rather than relying on willpower to endure the darkness, Iceland has developed a public approach to mental health. Light therapy is accessible, vitamin D is widely used, and outdoor activity is actively maintained. Central to this coping mechanism is Iceland's outdoor geothermal pool culture. These pools are not luxury wellness facilities. They are vital community infrastructure. Because geothermal energy is cheap, the pools are affordable for everyone. They serve as spaces where people of all ages gather, socialize, and negotiate, sitting in warm water while cold air moves overhead, a reliable way to feel like the world is manageable. Iceland directs the resources other nations might spend on defense toward robust healthcare, education, and social support. The country has no military, relying instead on diplomacy and NATO for defense. This focus yields remarkable results. Reykjavik consistently ranks among the safest capitals in the world. Doors are left unlocked, and children walk to school safely, a baseline expectation rather than a point of pride. Iceland has topped global gender equality rankings for over a decade. Since electing the world's first democratically chosen female president in 1980, the country has maintained strong parental leave policies and pay transparency laws. Living in Iceland is not without its contradictions and severe challenges. Housing in Reykjavik is increasingly expensive, and importing goods to a remote island makes groceries and dining out significantly costlier than in most of Europe. As the population grows through immigration, newcomers face the hurdle of learning Icelandic, a complex, notoriously difficult language that heavily guards against foreign loanwords. The country must carefully balance its finite fish stocks, manage the environmental impact of mass tourism, and navigate the very real threat of volcanic eruptions. The literal and metaphorical darkness always returns, but the people manage through systems refined over generations. Nobody is forced to stay in Iceland. Young people often leave to study or travel. Those who remain make a deliberate choice. They trade the anonymity and cheap convenience of larger cities for a tight-knit community and a volatile, breathtaking landscape. They choose to live on ground that is still actively forming beneath their feet. Iceland is a country that has survived things that should have ended it. Þetta reddast. Things will work out, not because the problems are small, but because they have been faced before and life continued. In a world obsessed with speed and scale, Iceland is a reminder that progress can also be measured by endurance, honesty, and what a community chooses to preserve. If this video made you see Iceland differently or made you think about what it means to build a life somewhere that asks something difficult of you in return, subscribe and stay with us. Hit like if this reached you, share it, and drop a comment below if you have been to Iceland or know a place that deserves this kind of attention. We read every single one. See you in the next video.